So tonight, we're going to be discussing a category of religious thought that I've termed the Alpha and the Omega. No, it's not a fraternity. And what it means is the beginning and end of things, from the first and last letter of the Greek alphabet. That's where the Alpha and the Omega. This can be viewed in what we call microcosm, or macrocosm, which is the beginning and the end of the universe, and in microcosm, the beginning and the end of each of your individual lives. So it applies to both. The macrocosmic is generally expressed by scholars as creation myth, and the microscopic then is what Albert will deal with next week when he talks about life after death. Okay, so let's start by looking at a general nature of both creation myths and then later what we call eschatological myths. That's the beginning and the end. So in creation myths, we're dealing with the significance of origin or origins. So on one level, creation myths raise the question of identity. People tend to define themselves in terms of their relationship to the past. Have you ever noticed that? Who am I? I look backwards, right? I look backwards. Here, the core idea is at some level, we are where we came from. We think of ourselves that way. Family, tribe, nation, these are the building blocks of our identity. And so the creation myth consequently asks, what's the ultimate source of the past? What's the ultimate source? If you go take the past all the way back, you might look at yourself, well, you got your family, you can go do all the research you want. But eventually, where did it all start? So creationists are interested in this question, which then tells you something about who you are, if you think about it. Where did I come from? So they also look at something that scholars call the nature of being. What does it mean to exist? You can take that home and think about it. But that's what creation myths are dealing with. Where did I come from? Who am I? What does it mean to even be here? Creation myths. You ever thought of that? Isn't it kind of strange? We're just sitting here. Where did we come from? What's this all about? It's a basic human question. Where did it all come from? Okay. So it asks such questions as, what does it mean for something to exist? What was before specific things existed? Was there anything before specific things existed? And this is an interest, why is there something rather than nothing? And what is the relationship between being, to be, and my being? These are, the creation myths in some way are dealing with all these questions. An essential question. Have you ever remember sometime in your life you thought, who am I? I'm here, but... So those are the questions. Now, over time and space, what we call cultural flow, creation myths then morph into a variety of interpretations. So if I even talk about one creation myth tonight, which I'll be talking about several, there's more than one interpretation to all of these myths. And that's the sort of things that mythologists study. So make that clear. There's not just one interpretation to any myth, just about anything, right? Various interpretations. And I think sometimes religions have problems because they get stuck with that idea that there's only one interpretation. There's only one interpretation. Some interpretations stress the difference between the source and the creation. That's between the absolute ground that we talked about first week and then all this stuff here. Others stress that that absolute is actually in the phenomena somehow. So there are variations, and I always want to point that out, variations on a theme. And that's one of the interesting ones is that somehow there's a loss of perfection. If at the beginning there's this perfect, you look at all the myths, then have to answer, well, if it's perfect, and I look around, how do I put the two together? So those are other questions that have to be dealt with when you're talking about origins. So that's just some general comments about creation myths, and it applies to all creation myths. So let's move to specifics. What? What's the picture?
Yeah.
I think there's universes, or there's the hand of God, maybe. Yeah. That's the earth. Yeah. Okay, so the essential creation myth for Judaism and Christianity, for both of these, is found in Genesis 1 of the Hebrew Bible, which I'm sure you all know. If not by heart, you've at least heard it somewhere along the line. It begins with a description of how God, or for Jews Yahweh, created heaven and earth. And creation is brought into being by both speaking, some divine command, God said, let there be light, and active work. So God then creates the universe, or the world in any case, in stages, right? So there's the active word. God said, let there be light. And then he goes about his acts of creation. And it takes 6 days. And then on the seventh he rests. You often hear people say the 7 days of creation. No, it's the 6 days, because on the seventh day there's rest. Anthropologists sometimes refer to this idea of God as what they call Deus Faber, God as craftsman. God crafts his creation. Now what's interesting, and scholars have noted this, that all those powers that are described there, man also shares them. Man also shares them. He's a creature characterized by language. We create when we speak. And he is also one who works and does. Which has led some to claim that the myth depicts God in the image of man. If you think about it. Which, in any case. So the other thing that's interesting here in creation, Genesis 1, it's known as creation Ex-Nihilo, which means creation from nothing. Creation from nothing. Yahweh is beyond space, location, and the cosmos is brought into existence out of a void. There's nothing before creation. I say that because this was much in contrast with Greek creation myths. The Greek creation myths, there's always a cosmos. Then the gods or some god orders it and puts it, but it's always there. Because the Greeks couldn't grasp how something could come out of nothing. And that is a bit of a mystery. But the same would apply when I asked my friend Jerry about the Big Bang. I said, what's before the Big Bang? He says, nothing. That's okay. Kind of similar. Because that question really can't be answered. In any case, it's also, if you ever come across this term, creation ex nihilo, it means that God creates everything out of nothing, just his will, just his command. Also, in this creation myth, no feminine principle here. Many of the great creation myths will have a feminine component. There's no feminine here. God is masculine and he creates. Another significant aspect is that this marks the beginning of time. Before creation, there is no time. Which is hard for the mind to grasp, isn't it? Because we always think backwards, and we always think of something coming before something else. And to get to the idea that there was no time, it sort of boggles the mind. What would it be to have no time? It's almost impossible because we're engrossed in time, so it's impossible to think about that. But again, I mean, that St. Augustine said, when he was asked what was before, he said, nothing, there was no time. Physicists say the same thing about the Big Bang. There's no time before the Big Bang. Time starts with the Big Bang. In any case, that's another characteristic of this Genesis myth. Also, that man is given dominion over creation. This is what it is said. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and have dominion over it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Now lately, certain what we might call the theological ecologists have asked the question, what does dominion really mean? Does dominion mean exploitation, or does it mean care for? And depending on how you define that, there's going to be a big difference as how you relate to your environment. I think perhaps unfortunately, for a long time, it's been the exploitative. The world's here for us. We can do with it as we wish. Doesn't matter. Well, I think we're starting to see that that might not be the wisest policy, even for us. In any case, this is another major feature of the Genesis myth. Man is given dominion. But there's also the notion that creation is good. If you look at after every one of the stages of creation in Genesis, and God saw that it was good. That's probably pretty important. What if you don't think it's good? What if creation isn't good? And there were groups, even some Christian Gnostic groups that became heretic, that thought it wasn't good. They said, how can this be good? Look at it. Look at what happens. How can that be good? Okay, so this is another constant issue that theologians have dealt with that comes out of the creation myth. It says it is good. If that's the case, then you've got to show how it's good. And that's what theology is all about, trying to show things. So, now, what a lot of people don't realize is there are actually two creation myths. There are two creation myths. There's one in Genesis 1, and there's one in Genesis 2. And they're a little bit different. What's interesting is scholars have dated the second myth prior to the first. In other words, when the text was put together, Genesis 1 got placed, but Genesis 2 was the earlier. They've been able to date these. So that's interesting. Okay? So the chronology is somewhat askew. Genesis 2 portrays Yahweh in a much more human-like manner. Genesis 1, there's this abstract power out there just creating. In Genesis 2, it's a little more human. There's a different order of creation, by the way. You should go and read these. If you just get Genesis 1 and get Genesis, the order of creation is different in Genesis 2 than in Genesis 1. And also, we get Adam and Eve in Genesis 2. Genesis 1, we get man, but we don't get Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are only in Genesis 2. And this is what it says. Now, no shrub had yet appeared on the earth. This is Genesis 2. And no plant had yet sprung up. For the Lord had not sent rain to the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed a man from dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And this man is Adam. He's placed in the Garden of Eden, and from his side, sometimes it says a rib, Eve is created. This is followed by the temptation story, known as the fall of Adam and Eve and their banishment from the garden. Their sin was eating from the tree of knowledge, which we generally get the translation an apple. It's probably more a pear. Probably, it doesn't say apple as we understand it. These have been transliterations. And it's only under the influence of this man that the fall became associated with sexual desire. If you look, Jews today don't see the fall having anything to do with sexual desire. They have to see with disobedience, eating from the tree of knowledge. And it's almost like this. Once you know, then you're separated. And once you're separated, you're alienated, so you will fall. You will always be away from God. Sort of like a child. You look at a baby, he doesn't know. He's one with his mother to a certain point. Then, as he develops, there's this notion of separation, which psychologists then tell us creates anxiety. It creates the notion of lack, of needing. And so this myth probably represents some pretty interesting psychological understanding of the condition of man. Once man is separate, and what does sin mean? All it means is separation. We are sinful in the sense that we are separate from God. We are separate. And when man becomes aware of this, then he thinks he can solve the problem himself. That's the story of Genesis. He thinks, and that's the whole story of civilization. Trying to get back to mom. And creating all the mess in between. In any case. So it's worth noting that Christianity would later develop what is sometimes referred to as a third creation. And it comes from Paul. It comes from the Pauline epistles, specifically 2 Corinthians 5:17, where the Apostle Paul refers to followers of Jesus as newly created. As he says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So it's, in a sense, a third creation myth. It's usually not referred to in that way, but Paul says it is. It's a new creation. It's a new creation. So that's the Genesis myth and the basis of both Judaism and Christianity, and a variety of interpretations with what you can do with some of those things. The question of dominion, the question of goodness, all these things, the question of sin. Okay? They're all interpretations that come out of that original text. So let's move to Islam. And this is what we find coming about creation in the Quran. He is the Lord of all the worlds. He set on earth mountains standing firm, high above it, and bestowed blessings on the earth, and measured therein all things to give them nourishment in due proportion in 4 days, in accordance with the needs of those who seek sustenance. Moreover, he comprehended in his design the sky, and it had been as smoke. He said to it and to the earth, come together. They said, we do come together in willing obedience. So he completed them as 7 firmaments in 2 days. 4 plus 2 makes 6. And he assigned to each heaven its duty. And he said, we adorned it with knowledge. a very similar view, right? This divine, absolute God, Allah, who out of his own will creates the earth and everything within it. And so you can see similarities here. It comes into creation out of command. Allah commands it out of nothingness. So it's an ex-Nihilo as well. Because in the beginning, there's only Allah. Nothing else. Nothing else. Allah wrote all things in the book, which is Quran, and Allah created the heavens and the earth. Very similar. Allah mentions many times in the Quran something that's known as the glorious throne. It's Al-Arash in Arabic. And it is said to be the largest of all the creations of God, of Allah. Exactly what the throne is has become an extensive theological debate in Islam. Generally, it's been referred to as Allah's authority. Allah's authority. The throne has a footstool or a stairway, which you can see on the right there. And so this is sort of, if you look at the images, the order of creation. On the far left in Arabic is Allah. You see a figure there? That's Muhammad. Notice his face is covered. You will never see the face of Muhammad. Then the throne, then the stairway. What is known as the kursi. And kursi is just the word for couch in Arabic. According to tradition known as hadith, Muhammad said the footstool in relationship to the throne is no more than a ring of iron thrown into an open desert on earth. Translation? The footstool is human knowledge, which can only lead to the throne, but can never become the throne. There's always a gap between human knowledge and the throne. And there's always a gap between the throne and Allah. These are sort of the steps of power in terms of creation. Islam also deals very differently with Adam in its creation story. After Adam disobeys and is cast out from paradise, so far that follows the traditional line, he repents, and Allah makes him the first prophet. Very different view of the role of Adam. Okay? He does what he's not supposed to do. He repents, and Allah makes him the first prophet in a whole series of prophets. So what is that what might that indicate? Repent, and you will be forgiven. It's a core of Islamic theology. God is merciful. All you have to do is repent, and you will be forgiven. As Adam did as primal man and became the first prophet. that sort of gives you that indication of the importance of this, the importance of forgiveness. And then it is the beginning of what we call progressive revelation. Adam's the first prophet, a whole series of prophets, ending with Muhammad. There is a spouse, although she's not given a name in the Quranic version. We know there's a female, but she isn't given a name, and we're not told how she was created. So she doesn't come out of Adam's rib in the Quran. And it doesn't say she tempted Adam, which is a big distinction. She's not a seducer. She's not a deceiver. And the Quran says, no one is punished for another's faults. Both repented, both were forgiven. That's the story in the Quran. This is an essential Quranic theme. That's why every surah begins with God, the compassionate, the merciful. You will always be forgiven. All that's required is repentance. Okay, let's move to a Hindu creation story. Yeah.
Before you go on, so Islam and Judaism, they're both the Abrahamic tradition.
Right.
So presumably you knew about the Genesis story, right?
Well,
700 years after Jesus, then how did this get changed?
well, things get changed all the time because stories are told and there are different variations, different interpretations. The question is, and this would depend whether you're a believing Muslim or an outsider trying to understand Muhammad. A scholar would say that Muhammad had access to these various Jewish and Christian groups that existed in Arabia at the time, all the way up through all the trade routes. He heard the stories, and together with his revelation, then put them together. Well, a believer would say no, he got it from the Quran. But in any case, scholars tend to think that, because these myths change. Stories change. Any story over time told enough will start to change, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. But there are these variations. But by and large, the overriding notion that concerns us, I think, is that Adam sins, Adam repents, Adam is forgiven. And if Adam is the ideal man, then that's the image you should follow as an individual. Okay, so let's go to the Hindu. Now I will say myths, because as you may have noticed in Hinduism, it's more poly than mono in most cases. Many things. So I think I've counted about 8 different creation myths that arose in different, and I'll just mention 3 of them. Perhaps the oldest is this one. It's known as the Indra-Vrtra creation myth. It tells the story of a battle between the god Indra. Can you tell which one is the god up there? And the evil dragon Vrtra. Vrtra was concealing all the light and water necessary for creation in his belly and wouldn't let it out. So what was he doing? He was forestalling creation. And therefore, he has to be destroyed to let the water and light emerge so that you can have creation. So this myth tells how Indra, the god of thunder, threw his thunderbolt into Vrtra's belly. Pop! Out came the light. Out came everything necessary for creation. So it's an interesting way of looking at creation. Something was stopping creation. Something was holding it back. And this myth says that the god opened up the belly, out came the water and the light, and we have creation. Now again, if you apply this to your individual self, often there are things that are holding us back, right? And that's what's called neurosis, I think. Things that our own little demons that hold us back, they're holding something, they have to be popped. And this is sort of refers to that as a human process as well. And so this allows the beginning of life on earth. A second major one is called the Purusha myth. This is a process of creation by a cosmic being by the name of Purusha. So a cosmic God. And he wants to bring about creation. Now, in the Genesis myth, God just says create, right? In the Purusha myth, the God sacrifices himself. He makes a self-sacrifice, and all the various parts of his body become all the various phenomena of creation. So this places this notion of sacrifice as being very essential to life. You can't have life without some form of sacrifice of something before it. And in this case, in this myth, the God himself sacrifices. Now that shouldn't sound so strange to Christianity, right? Not in terms of the creation, but maybe the new creation where Jesus is sacrificed or sacrifices himself. The notion that the divine is involved here. It's not just create. It's actually immersed in the creation. So there is a what we call an immanence here as well. The God's various elements are in the phenomena. So from his mind came the moon. From his eyes came the sun. From his breath emerged the wind. From his feet came the earth. And in addition, this becomes a sociological myth, it explains the creation of the four major castes, or known as the four Varnas. The Brahmins came from his mouth, representing knowledge and intellect. The Kshatriyas, or the warriors, came from his arms, symbolizing strength and protection. The Vaishyas, which are the farmers, the producers, came from his thighs. And the Shudras, laborers, came from his feet. So it's also a justification for the social system, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's trying to explain why we have the social system that we do. And it's been a very powerful image throughout Hindu history. Things are this way because they were part of the divine plan. It's very hard to get beyond caste in India. And it also then extols your duty, your dharma. You're born into one of these varnas, and the goal isn't to be famous or to be great. It's just to do your duty. So the Shudra doing his duty is just as good as the Brahmin doing his duty, because it's all about duty. It's not about me. It's not about what I do or what... We tend to think of social advancement in terms of, well, I'm now this, and I've got this, and I've got that. This is all about duty, about keeping some sense of order. Hindus were very concerned with cosmic order, called Vrta, and very fearful of what happens when you lose cosmic order. When you lose a sense of transcendent order, what happens to order in the world? It starts to collapse because it has no basis. In any case, my favorite Hindu creation myth, though, is this one. It has to deal with the god Vishnu. The ancient scriptures describe how Vishnu, in his cosmic form, lies asleep in the ocean of chaos atop a serpent. Can you see all that? There's the ocean of chaos. There's the serpent. And there's Vishnu sleeping. And down at the bottom, there's Lakshmi, his spouse, rubbing his feet. As a good Hindu wife always does. Right, Chris? No. So this is the beginning of the myth. Now, he sleeps for billions of years. For billions of years, he's asleep. There's nothing. Then, suddenly, from his navel, if you can see there, springs a lotus in full bloom. You see up at the top, it's the pink with a little... Out of the lotus appears the god Brahma. And Vishnu says to him, create. So it's an interesting sidestep. Vishnu doesn't create. Everything comes out of Vishnu, but then Vishnu orders another god to create. And he does. And you get the myth thing tells about all the variety of creation that there is. And this is known as a day of Brahma, and it lasts several billion years. One thing the Hindus and Buddhists had no trouble doing was recognizing the size of things. Time and space were immense. They're talking of billions of years. Then, at the end of that, Brahma comes back into the lotus goes back into the navel, and Vishnu sleeps for a billion years. Then, the process starts again. Boom, 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 boom. No beginning, no end. The universe has a beginning. Boom, boom, boom. And there are millions of universes. They come and go. Now this can do two things when you think in these terms. It can either scare the hell out of you, or it can comfort you. It can scare you if I'm nothing, or it can comfort you. I'm just part of this big, magnificent thing. Things come, things go. In any case, so those are the three creation myths. What about Buddhism? Well, interestingly, Buddha warned against any kind of speculation of these questions. So there's six unanswerable questions because you can never really answer them. You can just speculate. And he said they really don't give much benefit to the big problem, and that's how to get rid of suffering. But that didn't stop Buddhist history from having various models of creation. What they tend to do is, and there are lots of them, depending whether you're in Vietnam or you're in Cambodia, whether you're in Japan, what they all tend to do is have this similar notion that this is just one universe. Comes, goes, comes, goes, comes, goes. Okay? And it's cyclical. So notice that this what we call the Semitic myths have a beginning, and we'll see that they have an end. The cyclical myths come and go. So when Vishnu creates, he sleeps. Then he creates. Then he sleeps. So it's a circle. It never begins and it never ends. Where's the beginning of a circle? In any case, so those are the creation myths. Now we turn to, those are the multiverses. I like that image. Let's turn to eschatology, because we have beginning myths, and then we have, and all religions have these. They all want to talk about where things came from, who I am, my identity, and where they're going. Just as I think we do with our own lives, right? So whereas creation myths look at these big questions about existence, who am I, etc. Eschatological myths are concerned with the end of things. Not how they begin, but how they end. An end can mean either a cosmic ending, like the whole cosmos, or just historical cycles and ages. Now, why are ends significant? We've talked about why beginnings are significant. You want to know who I am, where I came from. Why are ends significant? Well, in theological language, they represent something called teleology. What is teleology? It's the study of the purpose or goal-directedness of anything. What we might say, the meaning. So if you're a carpenter, what's your teleology? To create wooden goods. That's the teleology of what a carpenter is. What's the teleology of your life? Well, what's the meaning of your life? People are trying to create meanings for their lives. So, in terms of eschatology, it's the purpose of existence as a whole. What is the meaning? What is the purpose? And most purposes have to have an end at some level, even if they're repeated. That's the goal. If you don't have, what would it mean to play golf and never have an end. That might be fun. Yeah. Have you ever thought of that? The purpose of any game is to end it. Hopefully to win, but also you can't win without ending it. It's a really interesting notion. The purpose of any game is to get this over with. And if you ever notice athletes at the end, they're happy. Okay, in any case, so that's why probably we have eschatological myths. Eschatological myths give life a purpose, a goal, a meaning, not just individual lives, but life in its total. So, what are the end myths in Judaism? It's related around the notion of the Messiah. If in the beginning there was the creation, if there was a covenant later made with Abraham, in the end it's the coming of the Messiah, who will then bring things back together and make things end in terms of historical process. The term literally means the anointed one. That's what it actually means in Hebrew. And it refers to the ancient practice of anointing kings with oil when they took the throne. So some of the ancient kings were referred to as Messiah, because the king was then seen as the one who would bring about the good things for the people. The Messiah with a capital M is the one who will be anointed as king in the end times. If history has a beginning in Semitic thought, it's a line, it will have an end. And that's the time of the Messiah. And so, this was always a fundamental belief in Judaism, that there would be a Messiah, there would be the end times, and then there were all sorts of reflections about who this person would be. And these were the generally accepted traditions by the time, let's say, of Jesus. He would be a great political leader, descended from King David. That's why the genealogies at the beginning of the Gospels are so important. They try and tie Jesus to David. He will be well versed in Jewish law. He will observe its commandments. He will inspire others to follow his example, and he will be a great military leader who will win battles for Israel and return her to her proper place in God's plan for mankind. Now remember, this is a people who have been conquered so many times. Okay, you can see how this messianic idea would arise, that somehow, if we're God's people, which we believe we are, then God will set this right. And he will set it right by sending us a Messiah who will win victories for us and bring us back to our position of power. And he will therefore complete the covenant. We don't actually find it mentioned in Torah, which is interesting, in the first 5 books of the Bible. But traditional Judaism has always maintained this as an orthodox belief. And that's probably because of their history, of this being continually conquered. It became just part of the accepted tradition. And for most part, it's been seen as a historic event. This will be a person. Okay? There were some exceptions. You remember the Essenes who lived out? Okay? They thought it was going to be some big apocalyptic blow up. Okay? But for most part, the idea of the Messiah in Jewish history has been a historical person. And in fact, there have been over 20 claimants historically. Let me just mention 3 of the most important. The first was this gentleman, Simon Bar Kokhba, 2nd century CE. He actually defeated the Romans in battle and formed a short-lived state until the Romans regathered, came back, and got rid of him. But he was considered the Messiah because he had defeated the Romans, and the Romans had left, but the Romans came back. The second was a very interesting guy. His name is Zapata Zevi. He was in the 17th century. He claimed to be the Messiah and had a very large following, both in the Middle East and in Europe, especially in Germany. And many followers came to the Holy Land with the belief that this was the end time and he would bring in the new world. Well, he went to Istanbul because he thought he could convert the caliph. He was wrong. The caliph imprisoned him, gave him a choice. Either convert to Islam or death. He converted. Now, you would think that given this, if you were a follower and believed he was the Messiah and he converted to Islam, what would you think most people would do? I'd say he wasn't the Messiah. And a lot did, but a very large number said, no, he really is. This is the ultimate test of faith. When the Messiah gives up his messiahship. We're very capable of spinning things. And there's been a book, a very famous book called When Prophecy Fails. And it deals with what groups do when their prophecies, especially of the end times, don't come about. You would tend to think, okay, it's over with. For some it is, but many, what we call double down. You know what double down means? Despite the facts. I believe it. So he still has some followers. Not a lot, but there's still some followers of this guy. The third here is Menachem Mendel Schneerson, 20th century New York rabbi who died about 10 years ago. His followers said he was the Messiah, believe he hasn't really died, and he will be resurrected in a spiritual sense. So, this is the idea of the Messiah. For Christians, Jesus fulfills this notion of the Messiah, but very different interpretation. Jesus is not a military leader who brings about political victory. Rather, he's a savior figure who completes the covenant through his sacrifice, on the cross. It's called the suffering servant theme. Very different notion of who the Messiah would be. But from very early on, after Jesus' death, there's a basic theological problem. Can you see what it is? If he was the Messiah, why was Israel not restored? Why did not all the prophecies related to the Messiah come about? And if his sacrifice marks a victory over sin, why is the world still sinning? These were big questions. Questions that might challenge your belief. Well, that's why this develops, probably. He's coming back. Early on, the notion of the second coming. If you read Paul, it's pretty clear that he believes Jesus will return during his lifetime or soon thereafter. Now, it's been interpreted both literally and metaphorically. If it's literal, it's what we call the rapture. If you know anything about that, it's literally going to happen. The clouds will open, Jesus will appear, and if you happen to be in an airline, in a plane at the time, what do you do, Don? Okay, well, some say, yeah, some will go up and some will go down. In any case, that tends to be more on the fundamentalist, literalist interpretation. There are others that just say that the second coming is any time the Spirit of Jesus is alive in the world. And you can see that in a variety of ways. But there was also the notion that his return would bring in the day of resurrection, as is seen in the book of Revelation, which Reverend Albert is giving a sermon series about now. There will be an end of times, and there will be quite a bit of devastation, and then it depends on how you interpret those images and that devastation. Most scholars, I won't say most, but a large number of scholars see the book of Revelation referring to the destruction of Rome. And not so much that God's going to come out of the sky and bat Rome, but just Rome's lifestyle. When your whole approach to life is power, you will pay the price down the line. Because that's the only way you know how to operate. And then you need to control, and then you need to persecute, and then you do and then you get into this notion where the Roman emperors some of them were pretty crazy. You talk about megalomania. I think I talked about Caligula, the great emperor Caligula. He would invite the senators to a banquet and said, "I can have your head at any time." And he was right, because he was believed to be a god. No one would stand up to him. But the book of Revelation says, if that's how you operate your world, there will be karmic consequences. This world is falling apart. And Rome was starting to decline at that time. It's those who had eyes to see and ears to hear could look over and say, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. But we don't want to admit it. We'll just keep playing the game. But eventually you will pay the price. In any case. So now we move to the Quran has a similar notion of the day of judgment. And this is when all souls will stand before Allah to be sorted out in terms of their deeds. Islam is a very big thing on a combination of justice and mercy. It's an interesting combination. You will be judged by your deeds. Now, when we think of that, that's pretty frightening, right? What also has to be understood on the other side of that is mentioned earlier, repentance. Allah is always forgiving. So there's this, on the one hand, there's judgment. On the other hand, there's forgiveness. And as in all the religious traditions, this is sometimes interpreted as an actual event or more as a psychological truth. Again, a variety of interpretations. What does hell mean when it's used in the Quran? Does it mean a place? Or does it mean a psychological state with the absence of Allah? And when you have the absence of Allah, you don't have truth, you don't have justice, you don't have compassion. You have all the opposite things, which are considered hell. So that's more the metaphorical interpretation. Now, there are two main distinctions about the last times between the Sunni and the Shia. I've said a few things about Sunni and Shia before, but essentially, can you remember the basic difference? The basic difference is who was considered the legitimate leader of the community after Muhammad's death. Okay? For the Sunni, it was an elected person from all the different tribes. Abu Bakr on the left. For the Shia, it should have been Ali's cousin and son-in-law, whose name was Ali. So it's the difference between should power have gone through bloodlines, which the Shia said it should, which is very traditional, or through this more democratic process where the tribal leaders will select the new leader. Well, the Sunnis won out big time, historically. And you can see the map there. Sunni is purple on the left. Shia is light blue. And whereas Shia mainly Iran, Iraq, with spots of it other places. But all of North Africa, most of what we call the Middle East, Indonesia, they're Sunni. They're Sunni. Okay, so the main difference then is that both have the notion of Al-Mahdi. He's sort of like the Messiah. He will return at the end of times to restore righteousness. Okay. To restore righteousness. I mean, any religion looks at its ideals, looks at the world, and says something isn't fitting here. And they all tend to have an end-time story where the good wins. So for Islamic society, it's Al-Mahdi. And there are historical examples of the Mahdi. He will be respected, he will be lawful, he will be righteous, and he will stand up for the message of the Quran as opposed to worldly power. The Mahdi means the rightly guided one. So here are two examples of women who claim this. The one on the left is Muhammad Ahmad, who established a Mahdist state in the Sudan in the late 19th century. If you know British history, Chinese Gordon was the general, defeated the Mahdist forces in Africa. The other one is Ghulam Muhammad on the right. He was claimed to be the Mahdi in India in the late 19th century. There's still the Ahmadiyya movement, which is about 10 to 15 million people around the world. For the Shia, on the other hand, there's the hidden Imam, or the 12th Imam. The Imams were the descendants of Ali. Ali was the first Imam. He was the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. He had sons. They had sons. Those were known as the Imams. And to Shia, they were the main leadership. And they were divinely guided. There was Hassan. Hussein becomes the most famous, martyred at Karbala, etc. Well, interestingly, the 11th Imam dies, or disappears anyway, as a young boy in Samarra, Iraq, which presents a problem for Shia. If your divine leader has suddenly gone and there are no more descendants, you're in pretty bad shape. Well, there develops the idea that he did not die, that Allah had raised him up in a spiritual area. It's called occultation. And at the end of time, he will come back as the 12th Imam. And he will establish righteousness. He will establish justice. And you know who's going to help him? Jesus. Jesus. Remember, Muslims have a great respect for Jesus. So Jesus will return with him in the final days to establish absolute justice on the earth. There was this gentleman in Iran, in the 19th century, known as the Bab from Shiraz, who claimed to be the return of the 12th Imam. Interestingly, he was arrested and executed. His followers then, one of his main followers was someone by the name of Baha'u'llah. And it's from that you get the Baha'i faith. Baha'is follow Baha'u'llah, who they say the Bab, as the return of the Imam, had said would come after his execution. So that's why the Baha'is hold Baha'u'llah as their prophet, or their manifestation, as they call him. But the Bab had actually made claims to be this Mahdi, or this return of the Imam. All right. Hindu eschatology. A little, again, somewhat different. As we noted, the worldview is constructed as a cyclical paradigm. It's not a linear model. It's not a beginning and not an end. It's a cycle. And that there are many different cosmic cycles. And the last time I read about them, I think there are 5 different levels of cosmic cycles. Hindu theology likes to categorize things. There's so many cycles. Anyway, the one that should concern us are known as the Yuga cycle. These are the 4 historical cycles. Every historical age goes through this cycle. Starts at the beginning with the golden age. Over time, it slowly goes downhill through the various other ages and ends up in the last one known as the Kali Yuga. What is the Kali Yuga? It is a time of complete chaos. Notice, and I found this on the internet, up on the right hand. Do you see what that says? The Kali Yuga is the last Yuga. It's the end times. It's the end times. Here's some of the characterizations of the Kali Yuga. Evil kings. People will be addicted to wickedness. Honesty will decrease day by day until the world shall be wholly depraved. Property alone will confer rank, and wealth will be the only source of devotion. Passion will be the sole bond of union between people, especially the sexes. Falsehood will be the only means of success, and women will be merely objects of sensual gratification. Decay shall flourish until the human race approaches annihilation. That's the Kali Yuga, and many Hindus say that's where we are. But there's hope, because the notion is at the end of the Kali Yuga, Vishnu will send another avatar. Vishnu will send. Now remember, an avatar is an incarnation of Vishnu. And avatars come, and there have been, I think Albert probably mentioned, there have been 9, and there's one coming. There's one coming. That will be the future avatar, the Kalki avatar, who will put things back into shape. It's said that they come to restore righteousness. When things will continually collapse until Vishnu has to get involved. Vishnu will send an avatar, and he will be known as Kalki. Now again, as many of these end time stories show, it looks like these guys are military leaders, and often that's how they're interpreted. They will get rid of the evil by destroying it. There are more progressive interpretations, but these tend to be the dominant ones. Because I think that's how we tend to react, don't we? How do you get rid of someone who's evil? You kill them. That's not an uncommon approach. So this is, again, you find this somewhat in the Islamic variations of the Mahdi. He will be a victorious warrior. The Kalki will be a victorious warrior, etc. And then finally, there is Buddhist eschatology. And here we have a figure known as Maitreya, the 5th or future Buddha. The last Buddha was the Buddha we know, the historical Buddha, Gautama, known as Shakyamuni. This 5th Buddha will appear on earth to achieve complete enlightenment and teach the true Dharma of righteousness. Do you see a similarity in all of these? Which probably tells us something about human needs, if nothing else. This need to have something in the end that is good. Or as one of my favorite mystics from Norwich says, in the end, all will be well. It's hard to believe sometimes, but what happens if you lose that idea? If it isn't going to end up well, then you just... In any case, what about this Maitreya Buddha? Maitreya is derived from the Sanskrit meaning loving kindness. Loving kindness. And if we look at the art of what was known as the Gandhara art of the Northwest, up in what is now Afghanistan, the early Greek art, images of the Buddha. The two most popular were Shakyamuni, the ascetic with his ribs showing, and Maitreya, the one who will come. So, when he arrives, his impact on the people will be profound. This is what one of the texts says. All will lose their doubts, and the torrents of their cravings will be cut off. Free from all misery, they will manage to cross the ocean of becoming, and as a result of his teachings, lead a holy and righteous life. They will be torn away from the net of passions, and their life will be one of joy. He's often seen sitting on a throne, and it's believed that he's in a place called the Tutsia heaven, and he's just waiting. He's just waiting for the time when things get bad enough that he will appear and make things right. And then the cosmos will collapse, and we'll start all over again. That's the one major difference. In the Semitic, once you get to the end, then what? It's the end. And then you can have notions of the... In the Hindu Buddhist, it starts all over again. This keeps going on and on and on. Okay, so these are the eschatological and creation myths. All religions have them. And again, why? Because they answer big questions. Whether they're right or wrong or true, I mean, but the fact that they have existed shows that there is this human need to answer these types of questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? What's the purpose? How's it going to end? Those are the questions I think we all ask at some point. Or if you don't, you're just oblivious. And if you're oblivious, you're probably in denial or you're trying to escape, one way or the other. Okay, next week, Elbert will be here to talk about the microcosmic side of this. Okay, this was the macrocosm, the beginning and end of the cosmos. He will be talking about the beginning and end of individual lives as seen in various religions. This notion that we're born, we die, then what? So that'll be... okay, any questions, comments, thoughts? Lots of ideas here, lots of ideas. But again, what I would suggest when you go home from these, what are the 2 or 3 main ideas you got from this? If you try and remember all this nonsense, I mean, all this stuff, you know, you don't, that's not, it's to get the feel for what are the big questions. What are the big questions? And then maybe to ask them to yourself. If those are the big questions, what are your answers? You might be interested, people say, well, what's after this series? This will go on for another 3 weeks. We'll take a little bit of a break. And then in July, I'm going to do a series that has nothing to do with religion, has nothing to do with philosophy, has nothing to do with thinking. We're going to take a 4-week trip to Australia. We're going to go to all 4 major cities, give you a bit of history about Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, lots of sort of a tour. I'll be the, what do we call, what's that guy? Rick Steves. And take you with various, go through some of the, if I was taking you on a tour of these cities, we'll do that. We thought maybe that'd be, for a summer thing, let's give, we've been thinking, no, let's just take a little break and have some fun. So that'll be sometime in July. You'll probably see it in the connections. Okay, good. Thanks for coming.